Dan McClellan responds to fat me, and I was a little disappointed in his response.
John 1:1 does not say the Word was God.
It kind of does.
All right, let's see it.
We know that what we have here is a predicate nominative. That is, both the Logos and God are in the nominative case. And so the one with the article is the subject, and then God, theos, is the predicate. And according to the source that you've cited, the predicate nominative is approximately the same thing as the subject. And it's joined by an equative verb, which we have here, the ame verb.
So that was the full clip here.
It was a full segment, but it's being stripped from its context. And the reason this is important is he's going to frame me as disagreeing with his point about the qualitative construction. When I'm actually, the entire video, you can go watch it, it's pinned on my page, I'm in agreement with him that it is a qualitative construction. The point that I'm making is the predicate nominative doesn't actually rule out some sort of association between Jesus' essence and the Father's essence. But instead of recognizing that, perhaps he's come to this conclusion too hasty, he has to suggest to you that I am either too dumb or deceptive to use Wallace responsibly.
And what this demonstrates is either that this content creator doesn't really understand what's going on in Wallace, or this content creator is misleading the audience.
When you hold to a conservative interpretation of Scripture, you are often, from Dan's framing, treated as too dumb or deceptive, or what he would call the apologetic endeavor.
What's going on in Wallace, because they were very careful to just include the first sentence, and they only read the first sentence of that paragraph.
We can make the same point for Dan's response if you watch the whole thing. He's not going to go through all however many pages are in Wallace in that treatment. It's some 30 to 60 pages, I don't remember. I was quoting what was relevant because I wasn't trying to disagree with Dan's statement that it's a qualitative construction. I was simply showing that the predicate nominative construction does imply something shared between the class and the object. So it doesn't rule out that Jesus is God. That's not proof, but it's also showing that this construction is open to Dan Wallace's conclusion.
Wallace describes what a predicate nominative is, because this argument actually makes my point for me.
And if you go and watch my original response to him, at no point do I disagree with his point that it's a qualitative construction. The whole video is me agreeing. The disagreement I was making there was when he uses Wallace and conservative scholars as weight to say using John 1:1 as proof that Jesus is God is wrong. The point I was making is that Dan Wallace uses that construction to make that very conclusion for different reasons. And I understand Dan disagrees with that. My point here is simply he has yanked my position out of context and framed it as me being too dumb or dishonest when it's not at all my intention in my response to him.
That ke theos no logos does not mean the Logos was the very God of Israel. It just means the Logos was divine. And it can only mean the Logos was the very God of Israel if we already conclude that the very God of Israel exhausts the category of deity. And to be deity, or to be theos in the qualitative sense, must mean you are the very God of Israel in some sense.
Which is not necessarily the case. It's possible, as Dan will cite John 10, that Jesus uses a proof text to show an association between man and the divine, but use it in a way that it's a lesser to greater construction. There is a proof text for recognizing the Son of Man to be divine, but also implying in the larger context of John's gospel that while Jesus' identity is similar to those judges of Psalm 82, his identity is also more fully the eternal Son of God, who is to be honored as God the Father, who shares in the same glory as God the Father since before the creation of the world. That is to say, the options Dan is presenting here are not the only two options.
I already know from Jesus' appeal to Psalm 82 in John 10 that the author of the Gospel of John recognizes that the Scriptures use theos to refer to other entities that are not the very God of Israel.
And the use of Psalm 82 to reference other humans as deities is not mutually exclusive with Jesus using it as a proof text for his own divinity and teaching elsewhere in John's gospel that his identity as deity is much larger than those human judges.
Doubles down on the fact that the Scriptures cannot be broken. And so we already know that the author of the Gospel of John does not accept that notion that the God of Israel absolutely exhausts the category of deity.
Which again is not exclusive, with Jesus both being the God-man as well as sharing, in essence, with God the Father, which he seems to teach throughout John's Gospel.
And so let's read what this content creator omitted from the screen and from.
But again, pay attention to the framing. He's trying to show me as disagreeing with him dishonestly, when I'm actually in complete agreement with how Wallace describes the predicate nominative and his conclusion that it's a qualitative construction. And you can go watch the original video to see that.
Reading. The predicate nominative, PN, is approximately the same as the subject, S, and is joined to it by an equative verb, whether stated or implied. The usage is very common. The equation of S and PN does not necessarily or even normally imply complete correspondence, e.g., as in the interchangeability of A equals B, B equals A in a mathematical formula. And later on, Wallace is going to explicitly reject the notion that John 1:1c suggests interchangeability. So, while we're interpreting theos qualitatively to mean divine, we're saying that logos is a subset of the category of the divine, of the category of deity, also known as gods. And again, if you are presupposing that the God of Israel entirely exhausts the entire category of deity, then you could say, well, that means that the Logos has to be the God of Israel, but we already know that the Gospel of John does not treat the category that way, and treats theos qualitatively in reference to other entities that are very clearly not the God of Israel.
And of course, at no point do I disagree with that understanding of the predicate nominative in John 1:1c, but I would reject the conclusion that that's mutually exclusive to the notion that John can use that qualitatively for both Jesus and for his citation of Psalm 82, while also enlarging our understanding of Jesus' deity through other events and teachings that we find contained in John's Gospel, which is exactly Dan Wallace's conclusion from his Greek grammar on that treatment of John 1:1c.
This clip, unless it is just part one of a larger argument, and I'm not convinced that it is.
Anyone who trusts the scriptures is stupider than Dan.
This clip actually proves my point for me.
A point I never disagreed with.
Consensus, even among evangelical scholars of the New Testament, is that the word theos in the clause, ke theosino logos, at the end of John 1:1, does not mean the word was God.
So this was what I was initially responding to, because he's framing this to show John 1:1c cannot be used to support the conclusion that Jesus is the second member of the Trinity. And to add weight to his statement, he cites Dan Wallace as well as evangelical consensus in agreement with him. So the point that I'm making in my response to him is that that's a bit misleading, because Dan Wallace and other conservative scholars agree that it's a qualitative construction, but come to the conclusion that this is just as much in support of the notion that Jesus is the second member of the Trinity. And I show that in my video. Misleading. Conservative evangelicals agree that it's qualitative, precisely as Dan Wallace says. The idea of qualitative theos here is that the word had all the attributes and qualities that, quote, the God had. In other words, he shared the essence of the Father, though they differed in person. And he cites the equative verb as evidence that this is a statement about the word sharing God's divinity, namely the same essence.
And this is where Wallace and I flatly disagree.
Which you're welcome to do. I don't have time to respond to 30 minutes because TikTok won't let me. But overall, I'm just disappointed that instead of dealing with my actual objection, you had to frame it as me somehow either being too dumb or disingenuous, when I was actually in agreement with you the entire time that it was a qualitative construction. Now, it's possible I've misinterpreted you here, but it doesn't seem that I have. So take that for what you will.